What is up, guys? Dzeeff here, and one of the most common comments that I see in my comment section from players that are trying to get back into Yu-Gi-Oh! Is, how do I play against decks that I've never really seen before? And this can happen to any player. Maybe you haven't played Yu-Gi-Oh! Since you were a kid. Maybe you quit when pendulums were released and now you're getting back into the game. Or maybe you took a 6-month break to do other things and now you're getting back into the game and you haven't really paid attention to the most recent releases. Regardless of how long it's been since you played Yu-Gi-Oh!, whether it was 10 years or 6 months, I know that I have 5 great tips for playing against decks you've never seen before. If you guys enjoy the video or if you find it helpful, please subscribe to the channel for more Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. My first tip is to do your homework. Basically, if you are going to get back into Yu-Gi-Oh! And you want to play at tournaments, look up some recent tournament results and see what decks people are playing. Once you figure out whatever the most popular decks are of the format, you can go online and do a little bit of research, maybe watch a deck profile or two, and try to figure out what those decks are capable of doing. This can also help you because maybe there are decks that are topping right now that you played against in the past, and that means you'll have a little bit more confidence playing in a tournament knowing that one of the expected matchups you already kind of know how to play against. This happens all the time, by the way. Right now, dinosaurs are really good, and most of the dinosaurs that they're playing were released back in 2017. So even if you haven't played Yu-Gi-Oh! Since 2017, you'll probably know what dinosaurs are capable of, and that can help you out a lot in a tournament. Tip number 2 is to try and figure out the overall theme of the deck as fast as possible. What I'm talking about is trying to figure out what the deck is trying to accomplish and how does it get there. For example, if you played against a Light Sworns, maybe you wouldn't be able to tell it was a milling deck just off of a charge of the Light Brigade, but if your opponent uses charge to add Raiden, another card that mills, that would be enough information to say, okay, this deck is clearly trying to mill cards to the graveyard. And that gives you information about, okay, they probably play a lot of graveyard effects. Another example would be against Altergeist. You know, maybe your opponent summons Altergeist Marionetter and sets Altergeist Protocol. That might not be enough to tell you what type of deck it is. But when your opponent activates the Protocol and special summons a Multi-Faker from their hand, you'll quickly be able to realize that it's a trap-based strategy. Now, it's not always going to be that easy. It's not always going to be Light Sworns or Altergeist. People sometimes combine different archetypes into one strategy, and people sometimes change up archetypes in ways you might not expect. In those cases, the best course of action might be just trying to figure out what type of deck it is in a broader category. For example, is it a combo deck that's trying to special summon a bunch of monsters and end on a big board? Or is it a control deck that sets a bunch of back row and only summons like 1 or 2 monsters in a turn? Now, in the long run, it is more important to figure out the specific interactions of your opponent's cards more so than the broad category of their deck. But if you don't have a lot of information to go off of, it will be helpful knowing what type of deck your opponent is playing, especially when it comes to side decking. If your opponent special summon a bunch of monsters, okay, probably hand traps are good, or cards like Darkler No More. But if your opponent set a bunch of back row, cards like Lightning Storm or Evenly Matched or Twin Twisters will be better options. Tip number 3 is to pay attention to cards that see play in multiple decks. By knowing what some of the cards do in your opponent's deck, it will make it a little bit easier when you play against new decks for the very first time. For example, a card like Borreload Savage Dragon, while it is part of the Boral archetype, it's also a card that pretty much every single deck that can Synchro Summon is going to make. So even if you don't fully understand what your opponent's deck is trying to accomplish, if they are summoning a lot of tuner monsters, you can pretty much guarantee that Borreload Savage Dragon is going to be part of their extra deck. Another way that paying attention to certain cards can be helpful is that you might start to notice patterns with certain cards. For example, Pot of Extravagance being played means your opponent probably doesn't care about their extra deck that much. Now, historically speaking, Extravagance has usually been played in decks decks that are more control based. You'll see it in decks like Altergeist or Guru or whatever. But also your opponent might be playing a deck that is a combo based deck but doesn't really care about summoning extra deck monsters. Dinosaurs, for example, have a lot of combos that they can do, and while they do summon extra deck monsters, oftentimes you will see Pot of Extravagance in their decks anyway because they have so many great main deck cards. It is very important information knowing that when someone plays Pot of Extravagance, it means they probably don't care about specific extra deck monsters. That's not to say they don't have extra deck monsters that they want to summon, but it means that they probably don't have an all-important extra deck monster where if they banish it, their deck becomes completely unplayable. So when you play against a new deck that plays Pot of Extravagance, that does give you a bunch of information. Tip number 4 is to pay attention and identify the common card roles in your opponent's deck. For example, pretty much every deck has a searcher type card. Pretty much every deck has a card that can special summon a monster from the deck, and a lot of decks have a revival card, and a lot of decks have a negation card as well. So these are roles that, while they might not look exactly the same from archetype to archetype, you can kind of get a good idea of what the important cards are when you play against a deck for the very first time. There are a ton of Yu-Gi-Oh! Terms out there that the community has come up with that describe these different roles. For example, oftentimes when people talk about a Stratos effect, they're talking about a monster that when you summon it, you can search one of your cards. If your opponent summons a monster and you ask what it does, they might say this is the Stratos of the deck. Now you should still read the card just in case to make sure you're not missing any smaller details, but you can at least know that it probably has a searching ability. That can be a very helpful way to cut out a lot of the confusion when you are playing against a new type of deck. You might not know what the cards themselves do exactly, but if you know the card role that it fills, that can be extremely valuable. Finally, the last tip in today's video might sound a bit strange, but basically accept that you won't be able to learn everything about a deck from one match, and honestly probably not even like 2 or 3 matches either. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a very complicated game, and the metagame is always evolving. Trying to fully understand how a deck works based on your very first time playing against it really isn't going to happen in most situations. I say this because I want people to know it's okay if you don't understand what a deck does after your first time playing against it. You can use all 4 of the previous tips to help you out, but you probably won't know everything after one match, and that's perfectly fine. Yu-Gi-Oh! Like any game is all about practice, and maybe at the end of the tournament, after playing against that new deck several times, then you'll know how it works. But that first match, yeah, don't put too much pressure on yourself to understand everything about it. That being said, I hope these tips have been helpful, and I hope that you guys take them to heart at your next tournament. I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.